Good morning, class. We are starting chapter 6. We're not starting, we're reviewing chapter 6, key terms, and we're going to continue reading in our chapter. So let's start with Westward Expansion. What does Westward Expansion mean, Paul?
It's the movement of settlers from the west.
The movement of settlers from the east, where the first colonies were, all the way across the country to the west. So all through all of that land, through the Midwest, where Minnesota is, all the way out to California. What is a treaty, Andrea?
It's like signing, like a signed agreement, like for a peace negotiation or like part of the land.
It's a written agreement between two or more nations. So it has to be written down. It's formal. What does it mean to ratify? What does it mean to ratify, Ethan? To approve formally. So you're not just verbally agreeing to it, it's approved formally. They vote on it. What is a territory, Ryan?
A territory is a part of the United States that is not within a state, but is organized with its own governing leaders.
Yeah, it's a part of the United States, but it's not actually a state. So it has its own governing leaders, and they work with the United States. They're owned by the United States, but they're not an actual state. Annuity, Andrea.
Annuity, an annual payment of food and money that the U.S. government paid to American Indians in return for their land.
So it's the annual payment that the U.S. government did. They paid food and money every year, so that way they could get the land from the American Indians. Because remember, we're expanding across that westward expansion, that manifest destiny. The United States wants to control all of the land. Reservation, if the American Indians gave up their land for the food and money, they have to live somewhere. Ethan?
Land set aside
So it's the land that's set aside or reserved. That's why it's called a reservation. So it's the land set aside for the American Indians to live on, because they gave up the majority of their land, but they get to have some land still where they can be themselves. They can keep their culture. Debt. We learned about the debt yesterday. Aiden.
Debt is something that is owed, such as money, goods, or services.
Yeah, something that's owed, like money, goods, or services. Yesterday we talked about how the fur trade ended because the fashion changed. People didn't want the beaver felt hats anymore. So with that fashion change, people don't want the pelts, and now all of a sudden the hunters are going into debt. The fur traders are going into debt because people aren't buying their stuff, which is why they were tempted to take up the United States government on the treaties to sell the land to get the annuities, because they get the money from the annuities to help pay off their debt. The last one is assimilation. Sam.
Adopting the values and habits of the larger group.
Adopting the values and habits of the larger group. When you're new somewhere, sometimes you lose kind of how you used to be, and you take on how the new place that you're at, what they're doing. So the American Indians weren't new. The settlers were new, but there were a lot more settlers coming in. So they were a larger group. So we're going to see how that assimilation affects the American Indians. We learned at the very end of yesterday that the settlers really wanted to have the American Indians assimilate because they wanted to give them more power, more money, more stuff. They didn't realize how devastating this change would be to the American Indians because their culture is so different. So we're going to find out today how devastating it was, what actually happened. See? All right, so we left off yesterday on page 112. Page 112, the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. In 1851, the United States met two different groups of Dakota to negotiate or discuss two treaties. The first meeting was at a place called Traverse des Sioux. Here, the U.S. officials met with leaders of the Sisseton and Wahpeton bands of the Dakota Nation. The second meeting took place 2 weeks later at Mendota. This one was the Mdewakanton and Wapakute bands of the Dakota Nation. Looking at the process of negotiating a treaty can help us understand the story better. Here's what happened at Traverse des Sioux. So in the summer of 1851, the steamboat Excelsior carries a group of Americans, including Alexander Ramsey and Henry Sibley, up the Minnesota River to Traverse des Sioux. Waiting at the landing are hundreds of Dakota who had traveled from near and far to meet them. The crowd also includes a small group of missionaries, Stephen Riggs among them, who live in the area. Everyone is there to make a treaty. July 18th, 1851. After waiting a few weeks for everyone to arrive, the Treaty-Making Council officially gets down to business. So I want us just to stop and think. There's a group of Americans coming, some key names that we've already learned about, and then they're meeting hundreds of Dakota. So think about that. Think about when we need to make a decision as a class. We have 28 of us in here. Is it easy for us to come to a decision with 28 people? No, because everybody has their own ideas on stuff. Well, I want to play this for our free time. No, I want to play this. We should use these rules. Okay, everybody has their own ideas that they're bringing into it. So think about there being hundreds of people involved in this process. So that right there tells me this is going to be complicated. Alexander Ramsey leads the U.S. delegation, a group of people who represent the U.S. government. He welcomes the gathered elders of the Dakota Nations, Sisseton and Wahpeton bands. So he meets with the elders. So there's lots of Dakota that are there, but it's the elders that are meeting with the American delegation. He tells them that the U.S. president has heard that the Dakota are poor and hungry. He says the president is anxious that something should be done to mend your condition. He proposes that the Dakota accept money and goods for some of their land. Not all of their leaders have arrived yet, so Dakota elders choose not to speak or ask questions. The council adjourns for the day. So we're going back to that debt. So the American Indians are in a lot of debt because there's no fur trade business anymore. They're not able to get the extra food. They're not able to get the tools that they need to make their lives easier. So they're in debt. So they're saying, hey, take the annuity because with that comes money and food. So you all are hungry. We're going to give you food. You're in debt. We're going to give you money. You just have to give us your land. And they're saying, we need all of the elders here. We're not able to talk about this. Colin?
Aren't they in debt because they ordered a bunch of things from the fur traders?
Mm-hmm. Yes, they're in debt because they put things on credit. They order in the fall, and then they trap all winter, and they pay it off in the spring, but they couldn't pay it off because nobody was buying the pelts. So that debt just gets bigger and bigger because nobody's buying their pelts. July 19th, 1851, an elder named Starface, or Wichakabiete, is the first Dakota to speak to the council. He tells the U.S. delegation that he would rather not make a treaty until all the young men of his band arrive at Traverse des Sioux. Another elder, Sleepy Eye, or Istavava, also seems reluctant. You're coming and asking me for my country. It makes me sad. And you're saying I am not able to do anything with my country makes me still more sad. Those who are coming behind are my near relatives, and I expected to see them here. That is all I have to say. So when he's talking about his country, what is he referring to? The land. Okay, when you're saying you're asking for my country, you're asking for my land. They're saying the country, the land is who they are. It's part of them. They live with the land. And now they're asking to take it away. As Sleepy Eye and the other Dakota elders leave the council, Ramsey threatens to stop all negotiations. Later, after the tension has cooled, both sides agree to meet again after a one-day recess. Why do you think Ramsey was so upset?
Because he really wanted the land.
He really wants the land. And is anybody willing to talk to him?
No.
No, they're in negotiations, but there's no negotiating happening. The Native Americans, American Indians, are saying, we need to wait. We're not all here. We need everybody here. We're not going to make the decisions for the others. So we have to wait. Well, they're getting impatient. The Americans want this done, and they want it done now. July 21st, 1851. Another Dakota elder, Extended Tail Feathers, or Upeyahidea, tells the council that his people want the government to make an offer in writing. When those sitting around here have seen this paper, had it explained to them, and talked it over among themselves, we will let you know our opinion in regard to it. So they're saying you need to write down what you're offering so we remember everything and we know exactly what we're going to get for our land. Ramsey agrees and the council adjourns. July 22nd, 1851. The Dakotas spend the morning considering the offer that Ramsey wrote the night before. Stephen Riggs and other interpreters move among the Dakota camps, translating the document. Henry Sibley and his fellow fur traders are busy trying to convince reluctant Dakota to sign. In the afternoon, a Dakota delegation hands back the document and promises to sign if certain changes are made. July 23rd, 1851. The Dakota elders continue to voice their concerns about the treaty. Sleepy Eye demands that the Dakota be given a copy to keep so they can tell whether the government is keeping its promises. So they're leery of the U.S. government. They don't trust them. So they want a copy of the agreement. Put it away, please. They want a copy of the agreement so that way they can say, you told us we would get this. You need to give us what you promised. Sounds pretty fair, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Starface says he hopes the government will not try to change the treaty after it's signed. Ramsey and another U.S. official signed the treaty. The time to decide has arrived. Despite their many concerns, the Dakota elders come forward to sign one by one. First, they sign 2 copies of the treaty. Then Stephen Riggs guides them to another table where they sign another document. Most of the Dakotas seem to think they are signing a 3rd copy of the treaty. In fact, they are signing a document that says they will pay back the fur traders with treaty money. So they kind of snuck that in on them. Do the American Indians know how to read the treaty? No, because they know their language. They don't know English. They have interpreters there. So they're signing copies of the treaty because they want their copies so they can hold the U.S. government accountable. Well, the U.S. government's getting a little shady. They sneak in a 3rd document. They don't explain to the American Indians what they're signing. So they let the Indians believe they're signing just another copy of the treaty that they agreed on, when in reality, they're saying, ooh, that money that you're giving us that we were going to use to buy the supplies that we need to survive, we have to use some of that money to pay back the fur traders. Because remember, the fur traders were going into debt because their business is ending. So I understand why the fur traders want their money, but they didn't explain it to the American Indians. That's not very fair. Extended Tail Feathers says he suspects the Dakota will never see much of the money promised them under the treaty. You think it a great deal you are giving for this country. I don't think so. For both our lands and all we get for them will at last belong to the white men. The money comes to us, but will all go to the white men who trade with us. So he's figuring it out. He's realizing, I don't trust these white men. I think that money they're promising us, we're not going to really get to see it. The legacy of the treaties. Does a treaty signed more than 150 years ago still matter? Do you think that it's 150 years old. Should we still follow it and agree to it? Well, yeah, because it's what we promised. Even though nobody in today's world was a part of signing that treaty, we still need to uphold it. Let's see what they have to say. Many treaties signed between American Indian nations and the U.S. government remain in effect today. As long as that is the case, both sides are legally required to obey the terms of the treaty. So even though it happened 150 years ago and nobody that signed it is still alive, we still need to follow it. We still need to legally follow what was agreed to. The reservation system. Most treaties in Minnesota created reservations on a small portion of the land purchased by the U.S. government. Reservations were pieces of land reserved specifically for the American Indian nation signing a treaty. This means that while the American Indian nation had exclusive rights to the land and the resources on it, they didn't outright own it. It was and still is a complicated arrangement. So they get to live on the land. They're controlling everything that happens on the land, but they don't own the land. Paul?
That third treaty document, if that treaty still is going on, so the American Indians still have to pay the purchasers.
Well, I'm guessing they've been paid off by this point. Because I think we read earlier that the annuity lasted for 50 years. So that was paid off in the beginning stages. So now it's 150 years later. They're not doing the annuity anymore, but they still get to have the reservation. So goals for reservations. American Indians maintained sovereignty or control over their affairs on their reservations. They expected this land to be a place where they could live as they had traditionally, hunting, fishing, ricing, and planting their food. The U.S. government, however, considered reservations to be places where American Indians could learn to farm and live like American settlers. Remember, they wanted them to assimilate. And the American Indians are saying, no, this was supposed to be our land where we could keep our culture. And the U.S. government is saying, no, you need to be like us. And we're going to teach you a better way. This conflict strained relations between American Indian nations and the government for many decades. Reservations today. Many reservations and communities established through treaties still exist today. Tribal governments create laws on tribal lands that are enforced by tribal police forces. American Indian nations and the U.S. government continue to work closely with one another. This is because of the special relationship that exists between the sovereign nations that had negotiated the treaties. So they make their own laws on the reservation. Their laws are going to be different than the laws that we have in the Twin Cities. They have their own laws. They have their own police force who enforce their laws. Ongoing debate, fishing rights. Disagreements still arise over how to interpret treaties today. Legal cases about treaty issues have gone all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court in the United States. One such case was Minnesota versus Mille Lacs Band of Chippewa. That was in 1999, so not that long ago. In this case, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that Ojibwe from the Mille Lacs Reservation could continue to hunt and fish in their traditional ways on lands they had ceded or turned over in an 1837 treaty with the United States. Language in the treaty reserved the right of the Ojibwe to hunt and fish traditionally, even when they were off the reservation. So remember, their laws apply to the reservation, not to the area around it. But the treaty said they could still hunt and fish on the land they used to own but no longer own. Over time, the state of Minnesota passed laws that restricted the rights of the Ojibwe to hunt and fish using traditional methods. What do you think a traditional method would be?
Like spear.
Yep. So traditionally, American Indians use spears instead of fishing poles. So there's laws in Minnesota that you can't go spearing. Okay? It's not allowed anymore. But the Ojibwe have it in the treaty that they can still do the spearing, not just on the reservation, but in the areas around it. Colin?
I saw this guy that was like had like a spear fishing line that went into the ocean and I wanted fish.
So that's harpooning, and that's the ocean. So that's going to be different. The laws for ocean fishing is different than lake fishing. So there's a difference there. There is harpooning to get because there's bigger fish, bigger like whales. There's much bigger creatures in the ocean. Okay, so the Supreme Court ruled that the state of Minnesota had to follow the terms of the 1837 treaty. So this is 150 years later. It's being reinforced. Nope, you have to allow them to do this because it was agreed to in the treaty. Years after the court decision, many people on both sides of this issue still have strong feelings. So even though it was decided, the Supreme Court said this is allowed, people still have strong feelings about it. They'll still argue against it or they'll argue for it. Even though the court has made its decision, it doesn't change people's opinions on it. They still have to follow it and abide by it, but there's going to be disgruntled people who are going to complain and argue still. What was that, Edward? I like that idea, but the reservation is reserved for the American Indians, and the people that are upset are the... What was that? Okay. Colin?
Why can't we just like live together and like each other?
Yeah, that is a good question. Why can't we just coexist? Live together. You guys, you be you live your best life, and we're gonna live our best life. It is a great question. Sometimes people think that everybody has to be the same for it to be fair. But that's not reality, right? What you need is different than what somebody else needs. So to be fair, everybody should have their needs met. So for, I've heard it explained where if we wanted to look into the window up there in our classroom, what Colin needs, the ladder Colin would need to be able to look through the window is going to be very different than the ladder that I need, right? Because we're different height. But if we all have the same thing, if we're all treated the same, Colin and I would have the same ladder. And he would have to stand on the ladder that I use to see through the window. Is he going to be able to see through the window? No. Okay. So to be fair does not mean to be equal, to be the same, to get the same things. So to treat the American Indians fairly doesn't mean we treat them the same way. But people don't understand that. They see, well, why do you get something bigger than what I get? That's not fair. I should get something bigger. Right? So people need to step back and look at it from other perspectives. And it's really hard for people. They want the same things as someone else. They might say, hey, I want to go spearing. Why can't I go? If he can go spearing on my lake, I should be able to go spearing on my lake. Well, I'm not Native American. My ancestors all came from Europe. So it's not a right for me to be able to do that. And people have a hard time with differences. So it's something that is an ongoing issue that we need to continue as a country, as Christians. We need to continue to work on that and to help people see that we should treat everybody kindly and not expect us all to be identical. We need to embrace those differences. With that, I'm going to say goodbye to our friends at home and hope you're having a good day. My friends in the classroom are sitting still.